Okay, I think we've given everyone a minute to get in, so we will get started. So, ahoy everyone, and good evening. Welcome to History Happy Hour Ohio River Pirates. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Indiana Historical Society. It's really exciting to see all of you here tonight with your beverages. I hope you're ready for a great conversation about pirates along the Ohio River. Today's happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. We're really appreciative and happy that One America has helped us make these history happy hours happen since April and continue to offer them in the coming months. At the Indiana Historical Society, we aim to be Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions upon millions of pieces of paper that can be books, paintings, letters, diaries, photographs, maps, lots of other things that I'm forgetting to tell you, and then finding interesting, exciting, or intriguing ways to share those, whether it be through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. All of these objects, all these collections pieces tell the stories of Indiana, whether that's about food, the people, or sometimes piracy. And so tonight we're going to get a little bit into maybe some of the crimes and robberies and maybe not so criminal acts that happened along the Ohio River. So before I introduce Abby Currier, our moderator, I have a couple pieces of Zoom logistics to walk you through. You've all been muted for tonight. Your screen will look something like this that you're seeing on your screen. You'll be muted tonight, but we do want to make sure we still hear your voices. You can use the chat box and watch the chat box because we'll be putting links and URLs as we go over the night. Don't worry if you miss one or have trouble copying and pasting it into your favorite web browser. We will deliver those links to you in your inbox tomorrow morning with a thank you email. If you do have questions tonight, Mark and Abby will talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll open up for your questions. Please put those in the Q&A box. You'll put those in, I'll see them, and I will keep track of them, and then we'll make sure we get them to Mark and we try to get as many answered as possible at the end. If you want to toggle how you're viewing your screen between speaker view, which is how we recommend you watching this, or Brady Bunch style, so you can see all of us in little tiny boxes, you can do that up on the top right of your screen. It may look a little different if you're on an iPad and you'll have to swipe a little bit. Just so you know, this program is being recorded. You can catch it on the replay on our website in the next week or two. That'll be at indianahistory.org. If you enjoy this program, consider coming back for more. Next week, we'll be here with more happy hours where we're going to dive up into the history and story of Hoosier CIA agent Benjamin Evans. That's on July 16th. And then keep an eye at indianahistory.org. We have more happy hours coming at you soon about donuts, Asian activism, the ERA, women's suffrage, more underwear, and so much more. I can't wait to share it all with you. So keep an eye on indianahistory.org for more information about this and virtual offerings coming to the internet connected device near you. Without further ado, I'm going to toss this over to Abby Currier, Education and Engagement Assistant at the Indiana Historical Society, to get us started. Hi, Abby.
Hi. All right, so like Callie said, I'm the Education and Engagement Assistant at the Indiana Historical Society, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. Dr. Mark Wagner is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, where he studies the prehistory and early history of both Native Americans and Europeans in Illinois and the lower Ohio River Valley. He has done extensive research on river pirates in this area and was instrumental in researching the wreck of the America, an extremely rare pre-Civil War era flat-bottom boat. So welcome everyone. And to start off, we're gonna start with the first question of what is everyone drinking tonight? I have this really exciting glass of water next to me. So, Dr. Wagner, what are you drinking?
I have a Diet Pepsi from the Zephyr Express, since I'm at the university. I know it looks like I'm at Cave-In Rock, but I'm really at the university. So that is my drink of choice for the moment. I'll have a different drink when I get home.
Okay. All right. So to start off, I was wondering if you could define the term pirate for us. You know, we all have a certain idea in our minds, generally based on Hollywood, but that's not always 100% correct. So what definition do you use?
Well, a pirate essentially is a bandit or a murderer who operates on the water, as opposed to a bandit who operates on land. And one of the major pirates on the Ohio River was Captain Samuel Mason, and he operated both on the water and on the land. So the distinction is just somebody who operates on water. And also the pirates are on the Ohio River Valley are attacking other boats going down the river. They're not landing and attacking towns or attacking people. They're waiting for boats to come down that have got valuable cargo, and that's what they're after.
So this is the first time that I've ever heard of pirates operating on a river as opposed to the ocean. Why do you think that there was such a strong concentration of pirates in this particular area? Like, what makes the Ohio River so special?
You know, the Ohio River drains the entire 1/3 of the country, and drains the entire eastern U.S. And then you've got the Mississippi coming down also, and they join right below Illinois, so they drain the entire eastern half of the United States. And the big market in the 1800s for any sort of produce, anything that's produced in the Midwest, in Indiana, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Illinois, is New Orleans. And the rivers are highways. And the way you've got to get your produce to market, where you can sell it, is in New Orleans or in Mississippi. And you've got to ship it by river down there. So it creates this tremendous opportunity for bandits and for pirates. You've got all this cargo moving down the river. And that's why you get them here. And the number of flatboats that are moving down the river, in some years there's as many as 10,000 boats moving down the river with cargo. So it's an enormous traffic. And the interesting thing is that all these boats have disappeared today. The one we found is the first example of one of these boats at a time when there were probably tens of thousands of them at one time. And the reason you don't find them is you're never going to find one unless it's wrecked. Because the boat itself is part of the cargo. Flatboats are one-way vessels. They float with the current. So whenever they get to the end, if they get to New Orleans, if they get to Mississippi somewhere, into Natchez, after they sell off the cargo, they sell the boat itself, and then they walk back home. Or they take horses up the Natchez Trace. And then later on, as railroads come in, they might take a train back, or they might take a steamboat back home. And the interesting thing is flatboats survive on the Ohio River and the Mississippi till the 1890s. Steamboats do not knock them out of business. The steamboats take care of another boat called the keel boat, which is a boat that can go upriver as well as downriver. But the flatboats are just great. I mean, farmers can still, if you're a farmer and you know how to build a log cabin, you can build a flatboat. I mean, I always told people that I could never build a ship that sailed on the ocean. Well, I could build a flatboat. A flatboat is just all square angles. If they've got the technology and the ability to build a log cabin, they can build a flatboat. Essentially, they look like floating shoeboxes. They're just squares or rectangles going down the river. And there is one. That is a model that was done by the WPA, Works Progress Administration workers, in the 1930s, and that is in the SIU Museum in Carbondale. And it actually is a very accurate model of what a flatboat would look like. It has an angled bow similar to a modern barge would have. And this boat would have had at least 4 oars, and only one of them is still on the model. The oars on the sides are like big steering oars, and then it would have had a steering oar on the front, and it would have had a steering oar in the back. And they're not for propulsion. They're just to try and avoid things. And there are all sorts of dangers on the river. They would just try to steer these things around rocks, steer them around sunken trees, whirlpools, any sort of obstacle that they saw on the river. And so these things would only be crudely steered, but that actually is a very good model of one. And it probably was made by somebody, considering the time period, it was made in the 1930s. It may have been made by somebody who had actually seen one of those boats.
So were there other means of transportation at the time that were just as popular? You mentioned that, flat bottom boats were really big, but
in terms of the river, flatboats are mainly cargo boats, and they're for immigrants, for family moving west. That's who uses them. But there are also upriver boats called keel boats, and they have an angled bow. And keel boats are just awful. I couldn't imagine sailing one. To get upriver, they would have to have the men walk down either side with long poles and essentially push the bowl. They would anchor these poles in the river bottom. They would push that thing up the river. And as soon as they moved a few feet, they'd walk back to the back and they'd repeat it again and again. Or they might do what they called cordelling the boat, which was they'd have guys on shore and they would tie a rope to the front of the boat, and they would wrap it around a tree, and then they would pull it up to the tree, and then they'd have to find another tree and do it again. And those boats were so laborious to get upriver that the steamboats knocked them out of, as soon as the steamboats appeared, they were gone. But the flatboats could always compete with the steamboats because they just went downriver with the current. So they didn't have any problem. There also are there are military vessels that are traveling on the Ohio and Mississippi River. There are, the Army's got gunboats out there in the early 1800s. There are also different types of barges. There are vessels that have sails that are on the river. So there's quite a variety of vessels that are out there. But
Okay.
flatboats and keel boats are the predominant types, and then steamboats when they come in.
So then what makes the flat bottom boat so susceptible to pirate attacks? Because you mentioned that they were most frequently attacked.
They're loaded with stuff. They're loaded with valuable stuff. And they were loaded with anything that you could sell. And some of the boats were immigrant boats where people are moving west. So you might have a family with all their possessions coming down there. But sometimes, merchants in the interior, there was no market for what, like if you're a farmer and you're producing, if you've got cattle and hogs you slaughtered and all this and corn, there's nowhere to sell it. And so they load them onto flatboats and they're going to try and sell it downriver. And that cargo in itself is valuable. But they would also have things like horses. They'd have different cattle, all sorts of things. They carried slaves down to there. And so there were a lot of valuable things that were on flatboats that were attractive to pirates. And if you wonder what a pirate would do with a bunch of hogs, or a pirate would do with a bunch of corn, they had dishonest merchants farther down the river that they would sell that stuff to. So they could get rid of that stuff. They could sell, Mason, who was the big pirate on the Ohio River, he could sell horses for a third of what their value. He would, if he could steal a bunch of horses, he would take them down and sell them to a dishonest merchant for, if the horse was worth 300, he'd sell it for 100. And the same thing with things like hogs and all that. He would sell them for half their value. So they had a network, or Mason did anyway, he had a network of dishonest merchants that he could sell this material to when he got his hands on it.
So you've mentioned Samuel Mason a couple times. Can you give us a little bit more background on him? Like, who was he?
I'm sitting in Cave-In Rock, and that is associated with him, although only briefly. He was at Cave-In Rock in 1797, which is a big cave that opens on the Ohio River. And Mason is the one pirate that we know the most about. If you didn't know about him, you might think a lot of these stories made up about pirates are fictional. But Mason's career, we do know a lot about him because he was caught by the Spanish and put on trial. And his trial transcript, I'm going to hold it in front of me, still survives from 1803. And it's got a wealth of information in it about him. What Mason, he was born in Virginia in the 1730s. And by the 1760s, he had moved across the mountains into Western Virginia. Then I think he was in Pennsylvania, and he fought in the Revolutionary War in the West, fought against Indians. And he was also a tavern keeper up there, but he was a violent man from the beginning. And by the end of the Revolutionary War, he had made Western Virginia and the upper Ohio too hot to hold him anymore. He was implicated in a number of crimes. And so a lot of these bad guys, he just drifts through the frontier. And he and his family drift down. First, they drift down to eastern Tennessee to the Holston River settlements by Knoxville. And General John Sevier actually runs him and his family out of eastern Tennessee for being thieves, for stealing things from slaves while the slaves were at church. And so Mason and his family come west, and they end up settling at Henderson, Kentucky, which was then called Red Banks. And when they get to Red Banks, Mason sees this wonderful opportunity in front of him. He sees all these boats coming down the river. And so he shifts from being a robber to being a pirate. And Mason makes it himself infamous with only a few years. There's a lot of people that go stop at Red Banks, say, you know, there are stories about the Red Banks people. There are stories about Samuel Mason attacking boats on the river. But they didn't do anything about it, because he was too dangerous to deal with. And then finally in 1797, he and his family, Kentucky sent a constable to Red Banks named John Dunn to try and get the town in some sort of order. Well, they killed John Dunn, and that caused a huge uproar. And they did what the settlers always did. They would take it to a point. And then when you get to that level where Mason and his gang are killing people in town, they organized vigilantes, regulators, rangers, whatever you call them, and they chased them out of Red Banks. They chased them west into Illinois, and they hunted some of them down in Illinois and killed them. Mason fled to Cave in Rock, where I am, in 1797, but he was only here for a very short period of time because it's too prominent of a place. Everybody knew about Cave in Rock. It's this huge landmark along the river. So by 1800, he had fled over to Missouri on the Mississippi River. And he resumed this same pattern of attacking boats. And the Spanish called him Mason of the Woods because what he was doing, like I said, Cave in Rock is too prominent. If he stayed there, sooner or later, somebody would say, I got robbed by Mason at Cave in Rock. And they would know exactly where to go pick him up. So what he did, he and his family operated a shifting series of camps in the woods, and they would waylay boats. They pretend to be interested in buying something, and the boat would pull over and they would rob them and kill the people on the boat. And they continued that behavior up until 1803. And what happened is they robbed the same person twice. It caused a huge uproar. West of the Missouri side was Spanish territory. The east was American territory, it was Mississippi. And they issued, both in Missouri and in the United States, they issued, arrest warrants and rewards for his capture. And he and his family fled to a town called the Little Prairie Settlement in Missouri along the Mississippi River. And they went to ground pretending to be farmers. And what happened is they scared the heck out of all the people in the town who were from Kentucky. And they knew exactly who he was because they'd known him from Kentucky. And so they ran right to the Spanish authorities and said, that is not a farmer down there. That is Mason and his family who have been robbing all the boats on the river. And so the Spanish surrounded it, caught him and his family. They had an inquest, three-day inquest in New Madrid. And that is the inquest which still survives. And what they wanted to find out is this guy really a pirate? And he and another guy named John Sutton, who was one of the gang members, turned on each other at the inquest and accused each other of all the crimes. And they provided a lot of details about how the boats were attacked, how they would kill people, except they were blaming it on each other. And one of the things they found in Mason's luggage was $7,000 in banknotes, which in 1803, $7,000 is a lot of money. It's a lot of money today.
Yeah.
It would have been a lot of money. And the Spanish asked Mason, whose money is this? And he said, well, let me ask you a question. Is it illegal to have counterfeit money in Spanish territory? And they thought for a minute. They said, no, we don't think it is. He said, okay, that's my money. And then, but the other thing that he would not lay claim to is when they were going through his luggage, they found 30 human scalps in his luggage. So not only were they waylaying the boats, they were killing and scalping the people on them. And the scalps convinced them they were pirates. And the Spanish decided to send him and his family. He traveled with his family. He had, I think, either 4 or 5 sons and other gang members, one of whom was John Sutton. And they sent them down to New Orleans for trial. But when they got down there, the Louisiana Purchase was going through. And the Spanish governor said, I have no time for this. Send him back up to Mississippi. That seems to be where he committed most of his crimes. So they turned around, sent them all back up the river to Mississippi. When they got near Mississippi, Mason and John Sutton overpowered their guard and killed their guard. And then they were going over the side, and Mason was shot in the head as they were going over the side. And they were seen escaping. And it caused a huge uproar on both sides of the river that Mason had escaped and was on the loose again. And what happened is, a short time after that, two of the gang members, one of whom was John Sutton, and another guy came in and said, "Oh, we've caught Samuel Mason," and they hit his head. And they brought his head in to claim the reward. And somebody who was there recognized, said, "You're two of the pirates." So it wasn't the brightest idea. And anyway, they were put on trial. Sutton and I think the other guy's name was May. They were put on trial in 1804 in Greenville, Mississippi, and tried for piracy. And they were actually hung. And we know that it exists because James Madison was Secretary of State at that time. And like I said, Missouri was Spain at that time, so he would have been involved in that. And in his papers, he mentions about May, and he said two of Mason's gang were caught and were hung in Greenville, Mississippi. So we know what actually happened. That put an end to Samuel Mason. It didn't put an end to piracy on the Ohio. There are still scattered reports up into the 1830s, but nobody operated on the scale he did. He was a major criminal, but nobody rose to take his place after that. You wouldn't have wanted to run into him.
So when I was doing some research, I came across two other names, Big Harpe and Little Harpe, that were also active. Can you explain a little bit about them?
Yeah, Big Harpe and Little Harpe were, they were from East Tennessee, in the Knoxville area again. The Harpe brothers, Micah and Wiley Harpe. Micah is Big Harpe, Wiley is Little Harpe. And people tried to link them to Mason, but they've never been successful, although it may be that there is some connection, but it's never been demonstrated. But for some reason in 1797, the Harpes go on a rampage, and they are traveling the backwoods with their wives and their children. You'd kind of have to think of them as the equivalent of the Manson family on the loose in the 1790s. And they're traveling the back roads of Kentucky, Ohio, well, Kentucky, Tennessee. They get into Illinois, and they're murdering anybody they run into and robbing them. So they're doing the same thing that Mason's doing, but they're doing it on the land. And they cause the same sort of uproar. They definitely killed at least 17 people, and they may have killed more people than that. And people are terrified that the Harpes are on the loose up there. And they do the same thing that they did with Mason, which is after one of the killings, they organize a group of vigilantes and they pursue the Harpes, and they manage to kill Big Harpe. Little Harpe gets away, and it's later claimed that he is John Sutton of Mason's gang, but he's not. That is, people who knew them both said no, they're different people. So Little Harpe just disappears off into the wilderness somewhere, and there is information available about them. They were put on trial in Kentucky, so at least in the late 1800s, those trial transcripts survive. But also there was an early historian, and this is how we know a lot about the river pirates. There was an early historian called Lyman Draper, and he later founded he was the first secretary of the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And Lyman Draper was born in 1817, and he was fascinated by the history of the Northwest, of Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, the old Northwest. And every year he would go on a long journey for months through the Midwest, running down all the old pioneers, running down the Indians, asking for diaries, all this sort of stuff. And it's because of him we know all this stuff. If not, you'd think a lot of it was fiction, but I think my recollection is he actually found the Harpes' wives and interviewed them, and so when you go to the Draper manuscripts, they are 100 volumes, and they're in the Wisconsin Historical Society. They're available on microfilm. A number of libraries have them, but they are like anybody who's researching the history of the old Northwest from late 1700s, early 1800s, they have to go look at the Draper papers. And he was interested both in the Masons and the Harpes, and he could never tie them, the two of them together. And if the Harpes had been part of Mason's gang, he would have been the person to make the connection, but he could never find anybody who said the Harpes were with Mason. But a lot of people have claimed, including, let me find it. Oh, this is a very famous book done in the early 1900s by Otto Rothard called The Outlaws of Cave in Rock. And he's got an exhaustive treatment of the Harpes. And he tries very hard to tie the Harpes into Samuel Mason, but he relies on a lot of folklore. And his book is a good beginning part if you're interested in pirates. But at the same time, you have to be careful with it because he was a folklorist. And at one point, he'll be having references, telling you what he's looking at. And then the next sentence will be, legend tells us. And he's off with some story that he picked up somewhere. So you can use him as a starting point, but you have to be careful.
Okay. And so you mentioned the Harpe brothers and their wives, and you said Mason's family. Was it common to have like piracy be a family affair in this time period?
Seems to be. Mason had his family with him. He had his 5 sons, and he had his wife, and he had his daughter-in-law, and they were all traveling together. And I mean, crime was just a family enterprise they were engaged in. Mm-hmm. And the Harpes seemed to be pretty much the same. It wasn't just Little Harpe and Big Harpe. They were traveling with several women that apparently they both referred to as their wives, and then there were children going with them at the same time. But yeah, the Harpes and the Masons both did that.
Okay. And so favorite might not be the correct term for this. What is one of your favorite stories that you've learned about river pirates in all of your research?
That is a good question. It might be that they're actually real because there have been people who've said it's all overblown. It's not true. There may have been a little bit of it, but not much. But Mason's story, the fact that we have his trial transcript, and this is all testimony that was sworn into court. I mean, if you didn't know that, you would think it was fictional. And so it makes you wonder how many more of these people were out there like him that never got caught and were doing the same things that he was doing. So yeah, piracy was a big deal and that's what amazes you about flatboat trailers going down the Ohio River in the 1800s. Most of the times, a lot of these people had never been anywhere beyond their town, and they're constructing a boat, and they're getting in the boat, and they're going to sell their cargo down in Mississippi, and they've got no idea what they're going to get into. And then when they get done, they're going to walk home. And I think nobody today would do what they did. It's just amazing. Oh, there we go. This is a painting by George Caleb Bingham, and it's either in the Missouri Historical Society or the Missouri Art Museum, and it's called The Jolly Flatboatman. And this guy is dancing on top of the cabin of the flatboat, and this is a flatboat crew that has just made it to, they actually have gotten through all the perils. They didn't wreck their flatboat. They didn't run on rocks. They didn't run on trees. They weren't crushed in the ice. They weren't stranded on a sandbar. Weren't attacked by pirates. And they made it all the way down to New Orleans. And they're selling off their cargo. And you can see 2 guys in the corner in suits who've got a notebook. And those are the guys who've just bought their boat. And they're recording the purchase. And like I said, the boat is part of the cargo too. That boat could go nowhere else. Because it's a one-way boat. So it is going to be broken up and sold for its lumber down there in New Orleans. And so all these guys that are there are going to end up like either walking, riding back along the Natchez Trace. And the Natchez Trace is very dangerous too, because there are bandits along the Natchez Trace that know these guys are coming back up the river with money. So you have to be careful of that too. And then later on, as things change, and if they had enough money, they would take a steamboat home. And when railroads come in, they would take railroads home. They would take a train home. So it got a little safer through time. But yeah, that is what this is showing right now, is a crew that managed to make it all the way to New Orleans and sell their cargo off.
Okay. And so you were instrumental in doing the research of the America, which was a flat-bottom boat that wrecked on the Ohio River. What does the shipwreck tell us about piracy and, I guess, trade in general during this time period?
Well, it told us a lot about the construction of flatboats.
Mhm.
Even though there were hundreds of thousands of these boats built, not a single example survives in a museum. There is not a museum you can go to that has a flatboat in it because they were disposable boats. They were built, they were one way when they got to wherever they were going to go. They were dismantled. So not an example of one survives. And we have about a half dozen accounts of how to build them. So when this one eroded out along the lower Ohio in 2001, it's the very bottom of the flatboat. You can see by looking at the picture above it, what is missing from it is the sides and the cabin. This is the very bottom of the boat. And not even all that is there. By the girl who's standing at the mapping table is the one intact side of the boat. So it was a 45-foot long boat by 12 feet wide, put together completely by wooden pegs. It doesn't have a single nail in it. And the artifacts we found in it dated to there were spoons with hallmarks on them that were made between 1801 and 1811. So it couldn't have sunk any earlier than 1801. So and there were other artifacts on top that are pretty typical of what you see in the early 1800s. So it probably sank in the 1820s, maybe. It was found by a man who said it had been burned, and he wrote an article about it and described it as having been burned by pirates. And there's a fictional pirate called Captain Plug. And he said this boat was burned by Captain Plug. And the state of Illinois and the Corps of Engineers realized how significant this wreck was. This is the first one of these boats ever found. And it remains that to this day. It is the only one ever found. And so if you're going to find out how these things are going to be put together, this boat has the potential to provide you with that information. And so we did an exhaustive documentation of it. And part of what we did too is investigate the idea of piracy. And that's how I got involved in looking at pirates, because he had said that this boat was robbed and burned by pirates, which brings up the question of, are there actually pirates out there? Did they actually burn boats? As it turns out, there were, and they did. But in the case of this boat, when you've got a boat like this thing wrecked on a single day. Archaeologists, a lot of times the sites we investigate are, where people may have lived for 100 years or 50 years, and a lot of things get mixed up. And the most exciting sort of sites are sites that are an event like Pompeii, something that happened on a single day. And that's what happened to this boat. It wrecked on a single day in the early 1800s, and nobody ever came back. Something happened to it. Either the river took off the superstructure or local people dismantled the superstructure for wood. But after that, it was forgotten and abandoned. And so it sat out there. And so it's like a time capsule from the past that can provide you with information on the construction of these boats that you can get nowhere else. And it was built different from, it's the way some of the things were done on it were different from any known account. And the reason for that is a lot of these boats are, some are built in shipyards, but a lot are folk built, just like log cabins are folk built. So guys who live on a certain creek valley may have a particular style that's different from the guys on the next creek valley. And so this boat is different from any of the published accounts. And it may just be local variation. The guys in one creek valley, wherever this boat came from, we don't know where it originated. It wrecked in southern Illinois. And the other thing I was talking about is about being a single event. But these are also can be crime scenes. And this was a potential crime scene. The man who found it said that it had been attacked and burned by pirates. So that is a crime scene. It becomes a cold case. It's a 200-year-old cold case. It's like, was that really true? Was this boat attacked and burned by pirates? So we looked at that possibility too. And you're looking at the boat after it's cleaned out and it's been exhaustively mapped and documented. And what we discovered was there was a tape running along the bottom And right below the girl who's standing at the table, you can see the orange body of the tape is laying there. The one corner, the one stern joint of the boat on the other end where the tape originates was completely intact. And the other end, by where that tape is laying over the edge of the boat, was all rotted. And so something was going on with that corner. And when we mapped it and we investigated it, we found out that it had been drilled incorrectly. Instead of the drill hole going through and attaching the side to the stern, they had missed. And so that joint was open, and that's why it was rotting. And somebody apparently hit it beneath, there would have been uprights like you see in the drawing up there. That bad joint was hidden under an upright. So whoever bought this boat probably had no idea. So it is a crime scene. It didn't sink from being attacked by pirates. It sank because somebody built a bad boat and they knew it, and they hid the bad construction. And wherever this boat originated, by the time they got to the lower Ohio, that corner probably gave way and the boat sank, and they managed to get it on shore. And that was the end of the journey for that boat. And we also know that that sort of thing was going on. This is a book by a man named Zadok Kramer, the navigator. And Zadok Kramer has maps in here and instructions for how to descend the Ohio River. And anybody who went in a flatboat down the river had this book. It was the only guide they had. And Kramer updated it every year. But he, in the beginning of the book, he is so upset at the boat yards up by Pittsburgh. He said the guys who run these boat yards are criminals. He said they're building boats out of rotten wood, and they're building them bad. And he said they're just death traps. And he called for federal inspectors to be stationed in the boat yards up by Pittsburgh. This is 1803. You know, people are worried now about getting big government off their back. He's calling for federal inspectors to be stationed in these boat yards because the boats that are being coming out of Pittsburgh, I mean, if you build one, it's one thing. This boat with that bad joint was probably bought. And because nobody would have sailed down the river with a boat with a joint like that if they knew about it. And so Kramer said these boats that are coming out of the yards up by Pittsburgh are literally death traps. And that's the case with that one. So we found out that it was a crime scene, just not pirates.
Yeah.
It was bad construction. That was somebody bought a boat that was poorly constructed and it wrecked down there. Anyway, but that got me into pirates because we had to examine, are there pirates out there? Could they have done this? So it was a combination of looking at the boat and its construction, and it was also looking at the archival and the documents and saying, is this possible? And when this boat sank, we know it couldn't have sank. It had, it barely could have been there when Mason was around. The spoons that were on it dated from 1801 to 1811. So the boat was built at some point after 1801, but I don't think he had anything to do with it. I think it was just a natural wreck right? And the thing about these boats, and this is what impresses me about the people who sailed these boats, is that these boats wrecked like crazy. I'm always surprised more of them have not been found. But they wrecked them on, you've got to figure these people didn't even know how to, they're getting on like about 1,000-mile journey down to New Orleans. And some of them, they've never been there before. And there's all sorts of dangers on the river. There are trees that are called planters that stick up like daggers out of the bottom. There are other ones that are called sawyers where the roots are up and swirling around. You can run your boat on a sawyer. You can run it on a planter. There are rocks you can wreck on. There are whirlpools. There are storms that are terrible. There are ice flows. There are collapsing banks. And some of the diaries of people they talk about, when you read their diaries, they'll say things like, past a wrecked flatboat, past a wrecked flatboat, past a wrecked flatboat, past a dozen wrecked flatboats, And so they give you the impression that the entire river is just littered with these wrecks. And so it is just amazing that this is the first one that's ever been found. There have to be other ones out there. Probably they aren't being recognized. somebody who really has to know what boat architecture looks like somebody else would think, well, it's just an old barge that's out
Yeah.
there, you know, and but this one was recognized for what it was.
Yeah, so we're going to switch to the Q&A portion and open it up for questions. I know Callie's been keeping careful track of all the questions you guys have been submitting, so thank you for that. And we're going to start with a question from Elizabeth. Were pirates predominantly white, or were there more diverse groups turning to piracy in this time period?
I think the pirates that we know about, Mason and his gang, and the Harpes, were all white. I think as you go farther west, you'll start to run into gangs that are more varied, that maybe have Indians in them, that could have Hispanic people in them, that could have Black people in them. But during this time period, all the pirates that we know about seem to be mainly white, seem to be Southerners, upland South sort of people. But I think it probably would change through time.
Okay. And so Michelle asks, what types of precautions did merchants start to employ, if anything, to try and prevent piracy, especially on flatboats?
None.
Okay.
I think part of it has to do with the fact that the voyage itself is very dangerous, and somebody who's going down the river is going to be gone for a couple months at least, so their family's not going to expect to hear from them, and so it's not like this boat just drops off one day and they're expecting to hear from it. I mean, they're not expecting to hear from it at all. So it's not until months have gone by that they realize that the boat never made it. Even then, they're not sure what happened to it unless somebody else on another boat went by and said, I saw, you know, your family's boat wrecked at so-and-so, you know, at such and such a location. But I think people were aware of pirates, and a lot of people were, you know, a lot of crews were armed and things like that. But I think they were unaware of the extent of which, like, somebody like Mason was operating at.
Okay. And do we know if piracy was a problem in any Indiana towns, especially from Madison to Evansville, which are on the Ohio River? That question comes from Jane.
Well, I'm sure there were. I can't think of any offhand. I can't. Most of the ones that I'm familiar with are from, like around the south of Cave in Rock, Cumberland, Tennessee River area. That's where a lot of it is going on. And then over toward the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi, that's where most of this sort of activity is occurring. I'm sure it did go on. There are, like I said, there are scattered reports even into the 1830s, like Abraham Lincoln's on a flatboat down to New Orleans, and they were attacked one night by people who tried to hijack their boat. And there's also a guy who, guy in Southern Illinois, and I'm blanking on his name, but he was a bad man in himself. But he owned a slave who had had his ears cut off for robbing a boat on the Ohio River, and that was like in the 1830s again. So it's still going on, you know, so it's always possible.
Right. And so we have a question. Some stories about Mason are fact-based, but others seem like tall tales. Like I remember a Disney series with Davy Crockett where there was a king of the river who sang a theme song. Are there truths to any of these folk tales about rivermen or pirates?
People got fascinated by pirates just like they are today very early. Mason passed into legend very quickly. There was an English traveler who traveled down the river in 1805 named Thomas Ashe, and he started all the tall tales about Mason. And he changed his name to Wilson, and he came up with all these exciting stories. Yep, there. And what happened is these stories remained popular through the 19th century. There's all sorts of stories about Cave in Rock, and travelers who came near Cave in Rock would all arrive all armed, expecting to run into pirates, and then they'd just run into some family that was camping out there. And but that idea continued on. And what Disney did, and what well, How the West Was Won. This is from How the West Was Won. You know, they both had pirate scenes in them. And this is Walter Brennan from How the West Was Won. And they actually filmed this down by Cave in Rock. They didn't film at Cave in Rock. There's another rock formation nearby called Battery Rock. And they filmed the pirate scene down there. And he is playing, Walter Brennan is playing Captain Samuel Mason, although he has a different name in the film. It's like, I'm trying to think, Jedediah something or other, but he's very obviously Samuel Mason. And the thing about this, Walter Brennan has got Mason nailed 100% in terms of his personality and his way of dress. We know how Mason dressed because when the Spanish captured him, they inventoried all the possessions of the Mason family, including their clothing. And Mason wore a brocaded vest like that, like Walter Brennan's got on. And he's the right age. And if you remember the movie, if you've seen the movie, Walter Brennan is just this conniving, dangerous sort of guy who pretends to be just this old nice guy who's happy to sell stuff to travelers. And he asks Jimmy Stewart to have a drink to our flag, and then he turns around and tries to murder him. That is Mason to the core. And so this is probably the most accurate representation you'd ever see of Samuel Mason. And like I said, Walter Brennan must have channeled his ghost because he got him right 100%. What happened in the Disney movies is, you know, Disney's are very obviously tall tales. They transport Davy Crockett down there. They transport Mike Fink down there, and they have fights with the pirates and all that. And that's a continuation of something that was going on as early as the 1830s. There are tall tales written in the 1830s about Davy Crockett and about Mike Fink down at Cave in Rock. So what Disney was doing in the 1950s was just a continuation of that same sort of storytelling. And so this, as piracy ended, as actual piracy ended, they, you know, Mason and the rest of these guys passed very quickly into myth.
Okay. Let's see. So we had a question about steamboats. So Stephen wants to know if steamboats were also attacked by pirates or if they just focused exclusively on the flat bottom boats.
I think they just attacked the flat bottom boats. I think steamboats move too fast and probably have too many people on them. You know, the flatboats are, I mean, the pirates are you know, what they're wanting to do is attack a small boat like a flatboat that's got a small crew. And some of the ways they do it, and we know this from Mason's transcript again, where he and John Sutton were blaming everything on each other. One of the things they would do is they'd go onto a boat and they'd buy the cargo out. They say, oh, well, you know, you don't have to keep going down. Just sell your cargo out to us. And they would pay the guy in cash for his cargo. They'd get all his cargo off, and the boat would go down, and a mile later, another group of pirates would be waiting to rob the guy of all the money they just gave him. So they would do things like that. And there's another account where they, Mason and his gang, some guy was carrying a load of firearms. And Mason and his guys said, oh, we'd like to buy those. And the captain was dumb enough to let them pick up the guns and handle them, whereupon they turned the guns on them and robbed them and took all their cargo away. And also they're doing things like, and this comes out of, again, the trial transcript where Sutton is trying to clear himself by blaming everything on Mason. And he said, he proposed to me that we stop the flatboat, that we kill the captain of the flatboat, that we kill the crew, that we dump rocks into it to hide it in the bottom of the river, you know, and all that. So that's what they're doing, you know, so.
Okay.
And I don't think they can do it with a steamboat. Steamboats just move too fast and are not dependent on the current, and they've got too big of a crew.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question about Samuel Mason. Jean wants to know what happened to the Mason family after Samuel Mason's death. Do we have any ideas?
We know a little bit. One of his sons was still living in Missouri. His youngest son was named, I think it was named Mangus, and he was still living in Missouri, about apparently turned respectable and was living in Missouri like 15 or 20 years later. His son, who was most closely affiliated with him, was named John Mason. And I think John Mason may have had some more trouble, but he eventually just disappeared. I think, you know, the idea about the frontier is that these bad guys just keep moving on. You know, if they get loose, you know, the frontier is moving west, and the environment they subsist in is this area where there's no laws. And so as laws come in, and, you know, they're going to drift farther west. They're going to drift up the Red River. They're going to drift down to the Arkansas River, places where there's still the frontier. And so they just disappear.
Okay. And so Jeannie wants to know, did pirates troll the canals at all? I know we've been talking about rivers, but what about canals?
No, I've never heard of anything doing anything on a canal. I would think the canal would be too hard. For one thing, the canal's got a beginning and an end. So if you rob somebody, they're going to know where you're going to come out, you know. And the thing about the Ohio and the Mississippi is that they, you know, they go on for hundreds of miles. And a canal, even if it's a long canal, it's not that big, but you can hide anywhere along. And that's what Mason was doing on the Mississippi, is he could disappear anywhere, you know, and he robs these people, and then he disappears back into the woods, and the next day he's 20 miles away somewhere. And so they could never find him, you know. And so canals are a different thing, right? I just think they're just too small.
Okay. And so Lynn asks, did pirates live on their boats or on the land?
Mason and his gang, when he lived in Red Banks, he was a tavern keeper. That's Red Banks, now Henderson, Kentucky. And so he had a tavern there. When he got chased out of Red Banks, that is when he and his family essentially just camped out everywhere. The first place they stopped was Cave in Rock. And then when they were along the Mississippi, that's where he became nicknamed Mason of the Woods. He and his family were just occupying, shifting camps out in the woods, and they could never find them. When they finally did get caught is when they committed a robbery that went bad on the Mississippi, and they were being hunted, and they decided to go to ground at the little prairie settlement in Missouri and pretend to be farmers. And Mason actually had a passport into Spanish territory, where somebody had lied to him and said he was such a nice guy. He actually had a valid passport, and that went disastrously wrong for them, because I think I said earlier, the people in that settlement were all from Kentucky, and they knew him. And so they immediately panicked when they saw him there and ran to the Spanish and said, "Those aren't farmers. That's Mason and his family are down there, and you better go get them." And so when he deviated from his regular plan of just occupying these camps is when he got caught, you know.
All right. And so I think we have time for one more question. Are there any documented cases of boats being attacked by pirates, but the pirates lost the battle, like the boats got away?
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln that's an example with Lincoln again. That's in the 1830s when he's a young man. He takes a flatboat, and they're above New Orleans, and they're attacked in the middle of the night with people trying to hijack the boat, and they fight them off and throw them in the river, and they go on. So that one actually succeeded, and I'm sure there's other ones like that as well. That's the one that I can recall offhand, because of its association with Abraham Lincoln.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wagner. And I'm going to toss it back to Callie for our wrap up.
Thank you. This was great. I'm now fascinated by pirates and want to learn more about murdering thieves. So you can imagine I'll be picking up some maybe more trustworthy books soon. And we'll put a couple of places where you can find out more in our thank you email that you'll get tomorrow morning. If you enjoy...
Pirates are always fun to read about from a distance. You wouldn't want to run into one. You never want to run into Samuel Mason or his family.
Right. I mean, I'm going to enjoy reading about them from 2020, you know, and not 1820. So again, thank you so much to Mark and Abby for a great conversation. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to come back for more, we have it for you. Next week, we're talking about Hoosier CIA agent Benjamin Evans with Doug Wissing and with our super moderator, Ray Boomhauer. Keep an eye out for more happy hours coming soon. As I mentioned earlier, on donuts, Asian activism, the ERA, women's suffrage, underwear, and a ton more. Same place, same time, new Zoom links, and you can sign up for all of that at indianahistory.org. Join us on Saturday July 11th, this Saturday, to learn more about finding your family history through military records. Kurt Wichert from the Allen County Public Library. And lastly, if you want some more, on Tuesday, just a couple days from now, we're partnering with the Association of Indiana Architects and the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission to bring you Building Community LGBTQ Spaces in Indianapolis. It's a free program where you can learn more about how this community has found their spaces in the built environment here in Indianapolis and what we're doing to preserve those. Again, you can sign up for all that at indianahistory.org. And we'll have a link to that tomorrow in your email. Speaking of that email, you'll get one from us tomorrow morning with all the links and a survey included. We will take you 1 minute. We'd love to know what you thought and how we can make programs like this just as good in the future and what topics you might be interested in the future. If you missed your chance to donate to the Indiana Historical Society, there's a link in the chat. Your gifts help us make talks like this possible and continue to share Hoosier stories. We're excited that we're finally reopened. We opened on Tuesday. I hope we'll get to see some of your faces soon, but if not, I hope I'll continue to see all of you virtually on events like this soon to come. This event will be posted onto our website in the next week or two, so you can catch the replay. And I hope you all stay safe and healthy and have a great evening. Thank you all for coming. Good night.